Welcome to Historical Context with a Historian. And in this segment, we will be talking about the Eskimo dog. What actually is meant by that? Because Jerry West, it's a little bit confusing. Jerry West seems to talk about these dogs as a specific breed, but also more generally just sled dogs. Sometimes he uses the term husky interchangeably. But in fact, the Canadian Eskimo dog, or Canadian Inuit dog, is a very specific breed. Now, husky is a term that is sometimes used more generally for just, it is a specific breed. There's Siberian Huskies, there's Alaskan Huskies. It is a specific breed, but it can also just be used sort of generally for any sled dog type working dog. So husky can be a general term, but Canadian Eskimo dogs or Canadian Inuit dogs are a specific breed. And I do think that this is what Jerry West was picturing, because the way he describes them is correct for the Canadian Inuit dog. Here are a couple of pictures. This is an adult one, and this is a puppy. Isn't it cute? This breed of dog is very ancient. It's very ancient. In the book, it talks about the two older Hollister kids, Pete and Pam, are researching the Eskimo dogs in the library for their project. And one of the things they come up with is that they look very wolfish, which they do. Most sled dog type dogs tend to. But also that they have been in North America for 2,000 years. And that's very specific, and that is true of the Canadian Inuit dog, because these dogs are believed to have come to North America, to the North American Arctic and subarctic regions, with a group of people about 2,000 years ago called either the Thule culture, or sometimes also called Proto-Inuit. We don't know what they called themselves because they didn't leave written records. Even more recently, the Inuit/Eskimo people tended not to leave a lot of written records. They tended actually mostly to have what we call oral histories, where things are told verbally. People remember them and people tell them instead of writing it down. And so we don't know what they called themselves. And so we just kind of have to give them a name to call them by, because we have to call them something. If we knew what they called themselves, we would use that. But unfortunately, we don't. But this group of people appears to have come from far northeastern Asia, across the Bering Strait between Alaska and modern-day Siberia, to far northern Arctic, subarctic North America. And they brought their dogs with them. And these were the ancestors of the Canadian Inuit dog. So they have been in North America for 2,000 years, that specific breed. And so that is correct. Now, another side note about the term Inuit versus Eskimo. Talking about either the Inuit dog, Eskimo dog breed, or even talking about the people group, the Inuit or the Eskimos. They're talking about the same group of people. Inuit is generally considered to be more correct because it is what they call themselves rather than what other people called them. The word Eskimo actually came from a different group. And so Inuit is more correct. It's what people generally prefer to use today. The word Eskimo is a little more controversial, but in the 1950s it would have been a very typical word to use. And so Inuit is more correct today. It tends to be what people prefer to use today. So we have the Canadian Inuit dog slash Eskimo dog that appears to be what Jerry West was talking about, because this happens in Canada. It is a Canadian breed of dog, and it is a specifically sled dog type. It has been in North America for 2,000 years, and that's what it is. So it certainly appears that this is the breed that he's talking about. He's not talking about huskies, even though he sometimes uses the word husky. He appears to be using the word husky more as a general term for sort of sled dog type dogs, rather than the specific breed. And there are a lot of sled dog type breeds, because in a lot of parts of the world historically, the far northern regions of Europe, of Asia, and of North America, very often in places with deep snow, places where it is not practical to have roads, really, because if you had them, they would be covered with snow anyway, and also where there's maybe not a lot of vegetation, there's not a lot of growth for feeding something like horses, or in some parts of the world, reindeer are used for like pulling sleds and things like that, like Santa Claus. That tends to be, for example, in far northern Europe, reindeer are sometimes used. But with dogs, if you are a people group like, for example, the Inuit, that tend to be hunters, hunting things like seals, you can feed dogs when you couldn't probably feed something like a reindeer. There's nothing growing. Like, you can't find them grass or moss or anything like that to eat. So dogs make more sense. And in a lot of parts of the world, far northern parts of the world, sled dogs were the way you got around historically. And you can see this in the number of breeds of dog that are like that. We have Samoyeds, we have Alaskan Malamutes, we have a couple of different kinds of huskies, we have all these different breeds of sled dogs. And of course, another one is the Canadian Inuit dog, the Eskimo dog. And they are all designed to be very tough, very strong. These are dogs that have to be able to not only pull a sled, but pull a sled potentially for hours at a time. They have to be very athletic dogs. They also have to be comfortable in very cold temperatures. So they tend to have very thick, dense coats, very fluffy tails that they can pull over their nose if they want to keep warm. And they tend to have great loyalty to their owners, very athletic, very energetic, this type of characteristic, because they're optimized for pulling sleds. And so when the Hollisters go to Snowflake Camp, which is in Canada, it makes sense that the Inuit Eskimo dog is the one that they're encountering. And it is correct that these dogs are perfect, excellent for pulling sleds. Now, everyone knows Alaskan Malamutes and Huskies and Samoyeds, and everybody knows these dogs. The Canadian Eskimo dog is not as well known. So why is that? They certainly have existed a long time. I mean, they've been in North America for a couple thousand years. The Inuit people and other far northern Arctic and subarctic peoples have extensively used them to pull sleds, because that was really the best way to get around. So why are they pretty uncommon? Even more recently, when Americans and Europeans, particularly the English, got in the mid to late 1800s, got really into polar exploration, trying to find the North Pole, trying to find the South Pole, mapping the Northwest Passage, all of this kind of stuff. And they often used these dogs as well. Here is a picture of an explorer in the polar region with one of these Inuit dogs carrying supplies. because it really was the best way to get around, by dog sled or by having dogs carry things. So they have certainly a long and important history. So why is it a breed that you probably haven't heard of when you have heard of huskies and other breeds? Well, what happened to the Canadian Inuit dog basically right after this book was published is that they started to decline drastically in numbers, and there were a couple of reasons. One reason was that there was a shift from dog sleds as the preferred means of transportation, the most practical means of transportation, to snowmobiles. And you can actually see this transition happening in the book. The mailman, Mr. Stamp, has a snowmobile, but people still get around by dog sled. And so really this book illustrates the transition point happening. It hasn't fully happened. People are still using dog sleds. It talks about how really good sled dogs are still in demand, even for law enforcement, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It talks about the Mounties using dog sleds. So they are still in demand, but it's starting to shift towards snowmobiles. We see that actually happening in the book. This is a transition point. And indeed, this book was published while that transition was happening, so it makes sense. And as we get into the 60s and the 70s and later, it's pretty much all snowmobiles. Dog sleds are not as essential for travel. Instead, they become just kind of, at most, something people do for fun, as kind of a sport or a hobby. And so the demand for these dogs is not nearly what it had been, because they're not necessary anymore. And so their numbers start to go down. Additionally, like many of these kinds of dogs, they don't make tremendously great pets, simply because they are bred and have been for thousands of years to be sled dogs. So they are highly athletic, highly energetic, very dense fur for very harsh weather. And so if you're anywhere where it's not very cold most of the time, they're going to be pretty uncomfortable because they're optimized for very cold weather. And also they have so much energy because they're designed to pull a sled and do this really hard work for hours a day. And so people that don't, you can't just have an Inuit dog in your backyard running around. Like, that's not going to be enough exercise. These are the kinds of dogs that have to be worked. They have to do things. They have to be running around. They have to be working hard. Or they're going to just be too full of energy, and they can be destructive. They can be aggressive, basically just because they're bored. And they have way too much pent-up energy that nothing's being done with. So they're really not ideal for just sort of family pets. They're working dogs. And so apart from their really purpose, pulling sleds, doing this hard work, there's not much else that they're really especially good at. And so the numbers are declining for that reason, because people don't really need them anymore to do what they had been doing. Additionally, there was a very controversial episode that happened not long after this book was published, within, a decade or so after the publication of the Happy Hollisters at Snowflake Camp, when a large number, a significant percent of the population actually, of Inuit dogs that actually belonged to the Inuit people were killed by the Canadian government. In fact, by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, by the Mounties. And this was very controversial because even later on, the Canadian government and the Mounties determined that this had been appropriate because there was a contagious illness in these dogs. and they had to be put down for the safety of all the others, that this was necessary because there was a contagious disease. But the Inuit themselves insisted that this was to kill these dogs that were so important to their culture, to kill them off to keep the Inuits themselves under control. It's hard to know the precise motivations at any point. Certainly, best case scenario, when this was done, the reason for it was at least not made clear to the Inuit. They either didn't get told it or they didn't believe it. Even assuming that it was for a good reason, they didn't. It was not successfully conveyed. So this was very controversial. In some quarters, it's still controversial today, this killing of so many of the Inuit dogs. And between all of this, between being replaced by snowmobiles, not honestly making great just family pets, unless you're doing a lot of like mountain climbing or something like that uses a lot of energy, and also a large percentage of them being killed by the Canadian government, whether that was for a good reason or not. It means that the numbers of them are very, very low. In fact, in the early 2000s, there were only a few hundred of these dogs, purebred, left. And so today, the Canadian Inuit dog, or the Canadian Eskimo dog, is quite a rare breed. Now, certainly there are a lot of people trying to bring it back. There are people who have dedicated to carefully breeding them, carefully raising the puppies, making sure they go to good homes, making sure that they're properly bred, to bring the breed back. But basically right after this book was published, their numbers went way down to the point where they were almost gone for a number of different reasons. Hopefully in the next few decades, Canadian Inuit dogs will be just as common as Samoyeds and Alaskan Malamutes and so forth. We can hope. It would be good if that was the case.